bells of Westminster Abbey roll out over London like slow waves of iron. The sky is the color of old parchment, low and heavy, pressing down on the crowds that line the streets. Black coats, white breath in the cold air, the rustle of flags lowered to half-mast. Somewhere in the distance, a child sits on a parent's shoulders, too young to understand why adults are crying over a woman she only knew from stamps and coins. Inside the abbey, the light falls in pale shafts through stained glass, painting the stone floor with red and gold. Soldiers' boots echo in measured steps. A coffin, draped in a royal standard, moves forward as if history itself is being carried on shoulders that tremble under the weight. Cameras whisper atop their tripods. Millions watch from living rooms around the world, feeling something indefinable slip away. For most of them, she was simply the queen. For a century of wars, revolutions, scandals, and changing morals, she seemed unmovable, a fixed point in a world spinning faster every year. Now, as the organ rises and the choir lifts its voices, a question hangs in the air like incense. What happens to a monarchy when the one person who made it feel timeless is gone? Beyond the abbey doors, the story stretches backward, through coronations and abdications, through bombs falling on London and cameras flashing outside hospital doors. The House of Windsor is not just a family. It is a stage, a battlefield, a mirror in which an entire nation has tried to see its better self, and often found its flaws instead. And as the coffin moves forward, another story begins, not of what the Windsors have been, but of what they must become, or cease to be at all. Soft call to action. If you wish to keep walking these echoing corridors of power and memory with us, consider liking this video and subscribing, so the next of history finds you when it is told. A name forged in war. The first hint that a name could become dangerous did not come in a palace, but on an ordinary London street. It was a cold evening in 1915. Coal smoke lay low over the city, and a fine drizzle clung to hats and coat collars. A woman stood outside a newspaper stand, a ration book tucked under her arm, staring at the headlines. Zeppelin raid, the ink screamed. German airships over London. She did not know much about dynasties or family trees. But she knew this. The men killing her neighbors came from Germany. And somewhere in a great house she would never enter, her own king carried a German name. Inside Buckingham Palace, the air was warmer but no less heavy. Fires crackled in marble fireplaces, throwing light across portraits of ancestors from half a dozen European courts. Their frames were carved and gilded, their faces a blur of uniforms and sashes, almost interchangeable. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It had always been a mouthful, but for decades it had sounded respectable, even fashionable. Evidence that Britain's royal family was woven into a network of royal houses stretching from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Now, each time a bomb fell, the syllables felt sharper, like broken glass in the mouth. King George V walked the length of his study, the heels of his boots making small, precise sounds on the polished floor. He was not a man given easily to drama. He liked routine, uniforms, exactness. Every morning, he read reports from the front, lists of casualties, positions held, positions lost. He saw maps so often that the names of foreign villages began to haunt his sleep. But there was a different kind of report on his desk now, letters from members of Parliament, opinion pieces cut from newspapers, notes from trusted advisors. All of them circled the same unease. How long could a king called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha survive a war against Germany? Across the Channel, the war remade sound and color. In the trenches of France, mud swallowed boots and hope alike. A young British soldier, Thomas Evans, sat hunched in a dugout, his fingers numb even inside his gloves. Somewhere above, artillery grumbled, a steady, rolling growl. Someone passed down a letter from home, its paper already softened by many hands. Tom read the familiar scrawl. They say the king is doing all he can. They say he visits the wounded. But his name, is it true he's German as well? He stared at the words for a long time. He had never thought much about the royal family. They were distant figures, on coins and in picture books. Yet in the cold, in the mud, he wanted to feel that the man whose image hung in barracks was one of them, solidly, unquestionably British. The doubt felt like a small crack in something that needed to stay whole. Back in London, George's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, brought more clippings to the king, carefully arranged. The smell of fresh ink clung to the paper. One article spoke of the Gotha bombers, the German planes whose name was a direct echo of the royal family's own title. Each time a Gotha raided London, the word "Got" Ha appeared in headlines beside photographs of blasted houses and shattered glass. The connection could not be missed. "Your Majesty," Stamfordham said quietly, "we are approaching a moment where your name may be held against you." George knew this already. He had seen it in the tight faces of ministers when they spoke of public feeling. He had heard it in the careful way people emphasized our boys at the front, our factories, our struggle, as if a space had opened up, a question about whether the royal house was fully inside that hour. He was a king in wartime, but he was also a grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to the Kaiser in Berlin, cousin to the Tsar in Russia. That web of blood, once a source of strength, now felt like a trap. On certain evenings, Queen Mary joined him in the study. The lamplight softened the strict lines of her face. She, too, was the product of intertwined royal houses, raised to see Europe as a kind of extended family. "It is not our loyalty that is in doubt," she said once, her voice low. "It is their perception of it." She gestured not to the portraits but toward the city beyond the palace gates, where searchlights swept the sky and people slept in fear of sirens. Names matter to them now, in a way they never did. The king picked up one of the clippings, fingers tracing the inked word Gotha. Outside, a distant boom rolled through the night. For a brief moment, the palace and the tenement house, the trench and the newspaper shop were bound by that sound. War was no longer something that happened over there. It was here, in the sky above London, in the names printed in bold type, in the uneasy glances at the coins people exchanged to buy bread. Could a few syllables threaten a throne that had stood for centuries? Could a name chosen by ancestors in another age imperil an institution meant to be above politics, above the quarrels of nations? Slowly, the answer inside the palace was becoming clear. A name could not win a war, but it could lose the people. And once the people were lost, the crown followed. The thought settled over George V like a weight heavier than the ermine robes he wore at coronations. Somewhere in the corridors behind him, a clock chimed the hour, its steady notes marking time not just in minutes, but in the narrowing space left for indecision. Spring came late to London in 1917. The trees in St. James's Park stood bare longer than usual, their branches outlined against a sky the color of lead. On some mornings, the mist was so thick that the towers of Westminster vanished, leaving only the gas lamps and the sound of footsteps on wet pavement. In this pale, uncertain light, the distance between the palace and the people seemed to shrink. George V looked out from a window in Buckingham Palace as a column of soldiers marched past, their boots synchronized, their uniforms dark against the pale road. Many of them were barely older than his eldest sons. He watched until the last figure disappeared from view, then turned back to his desk where another stack of papers waited, reports of food shortages, mutterings about profiteers, and more letters from ministers speaking, in carefully coded language, about the German question. One morning, Lord Stamfordham arrived earlier than usual, his expression tightly controlled. He carried a folder bound with a simple ribbon, the sort of ordinary detail that made it stand out in a room filled with ornate objects. "Your Majesty," he said, "I think we must discuss solutions, not just problems." George lowered himself into his chair. The leather creaked softly. "Go on," he said. "Anti-German feeling is not easing," Stamfordham began. "If anything, it grows sharper with every raid. The word Gotha is now associated in the public mind with destruction. The connection to the royal house is unavoidable." He paused, then continued. "If we cannot change the war, we can change what we are called within it." There it was, spoken plainly at last. change what we are called. The king frowned, his thick brows drawing together. You are suggesting, he said slowly, that I cast aside the name my father bore, the name I was born under, the name of my grandfather, Prince Albert. Stamfordham did not look away. I am suggesting, sire, that you protect the future of the crown. A name is not the monarchy, but in times like these it can become a symbol of it. The people must not feel their king shares anything with the enemy, even a syllable. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air heavier. On the mantel, the clock ticked on, indifferent. In one corner of the study, a portrait of Queen Victoria watched, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond any present crisis. George had always felt her presence as a kind of pressure, a reminder of a standard he must not fail. Later he spoke with Queen Mary. They walked slowly through a corridor hung with tapestries, their footsteps muffled by thick carpet, the scent of beeswax polish and old wood clung to the air. If we change the name, he said, what does that say about us, about our past? Mary's gloved hand brushed lightly over the back of a nearby chair, an unconscious gesture. It says, she replied, that we understand the times we live in. Our ancestors did not face this kind of war. They did not see their capital bombed. They did not hear their own name in reports of enemy machines. We are still the same people, George, but we may need a different face for the world to see. That night in houses from Whitechapel to Kensington, people huddled in the half-light of shared candles to read the day's papers. Stories spread of German shops vandalized, of families changing their names to sound more English. In a small terraced house, a tailor named Heinrich had already begun signing his work Henry. His wife, folding shirts still warm from the iron, said, "It feels like lying." He shook his head. "It feels like staying alive." The royal family was not so different. Survival for them did not mean hiding. It meant adapting in plain view. Possible names were quietly discussed. Some were old dynastic titles. Others invoked ancient English houses long absorbed into the tide of history. But one word kept returning to the table: Windsor. It was more than a castle. It was an image. Stone and river, turrets outlined against a changing sky. A place people felt belonged to the story of England itself. In a private meeting, someone spoke the word aloud, letting it hang in the air. Windsor. It sounded simple, solid, almost inevitable, as if it had been waiting all along. George thought of the castle, of evenings there when the sun set behind its battlements, turning the stone warm and golden, of military parades held on the long walk before its gates, of crowds craning their necks to glimpse a flag fluttering high above the towers. Windsor, Queen Mary repeated later, testing the weight of it. It has the sound of the country in it. The king nodded slowly. It would mean renouncing more than a name, he said. German titles, connections. He did not need to say aloud that some of those connections were to cousins now on the other side of the front line. Blood had been spilled on fields where his own relatives commanded opposing armies. Elsewhere in Europe, other monarchies tottered. In Russia, the Tsar's grip on power was slipping. Crowds in Petrograd shouted slogans that would have been unthinkable a decade before. The age when royal families could rely on tradition alone was ending. George could feel that truth growing sharper with every dispatch. In his study, late one afternoon, with rain tapping against the window panes, he picked up a pen. The paper before him carried the formal language of a proclamation, but beneath the flourishes and titles, the reality was stark. He was about to end the era of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha with a few strokes of ink. He hesitated for a heartbeat, hearing in his mind not just his own voice, but the murmur of generations. Then, with a steady hand, George V began to write, declaring that the royal house and the family name would henceforth be Windsor. Far from the palace, in a cramped office where a junior civil servant sorted documents, the news would later arrive as a simple memo, another piece of paper to be filed. In a barracks mess hall, it would arrive as a joke one soldier told another. "Did you hear? The king's gone English." In a tenement kitchen, it would become a line read aloud over the clatter of dishes. Windsor, like the castle, sounds right, doesn't it? But in this moment, as the ink dried on the king's signature, no one yet knew what this change would mean, not just for a family, but for an institution trying to reshape itself under the roar of war. The announcement came not with trumpet fanfares, but with ink. On a gray July morning in 1917, a clerk in a London newspaper office unfolded a fresh sheet from the telegraph machine. The message was brief, written in that clipped official style that wasted no words. The royal house had taken a new name. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. The clerk frowned once, shrugged, and carried it over to the editor. Within hours, presses shuddered to life, metal plates locked into place, and the new words rolled out into the world on rivers of newsprint. On street corners across the city, paper boys, cries cut through the rattle of trams and the rumble of carts. King changes name, royal family now House of Windsor. The sound was strange at first. Windsor, shouted like a headline instead of whispered like a storybook castle. Outside a factory gate in the East End, men coming off a long shift paused to buy copies, their hands still smelling of oil and metal. One of them, a broad-shouldered fitter named Jack Harris, read the first paragraph and let out a short laugh. "So that's it then," he said. "King-'s gone proper English." His friend raised an eyebrow. It'd bother you before." Jack thought of his brother in the trenches, of letters full of mud and blood and the names of German towns he could barely pronounce. "Didn't think about it much," he admitted. "But I suppose, well, it feels right, doesn't it? Windsor, like the place, feels ours." In a quieter part of the city, the woman who had once stared at the Zeppelin raid headline read the same story at her kitchen table. Her daughter sounded out the words slowly, tracing each line with a finger. "Windsor," the child said and smiled. "Like the castle in my book." The mother nodded. Something inside her eased by a degree, as if a small misalignment had finally clicked into place. In the trenches, weeks later, Tom Evans sat on an ammunition crate, turning a battered newspaper over in his hands. The headline had been smudged by many fingers, but the important word was still clear. Windsor. He tried it under his breath. It sounded less distant somehow, less foreign. He looked up at the line of men filing past, their uniforms caked with dried mud, and imagined the king wearing that name like a badge, standing a little closer to them than before. "Tom," someone called from behind him, "you daydreaming about tea again?" He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket. "Just thinking about home," he said. Back at Buckingham Palace, there was no obvious outward change. The same guards stood at their posts. The same lamps glowed in the same windows. But within, the name had already begun to reshape the space it occupied. Official stationery was reprinted. Seals were recut. Courtiers practiced the new form in their mouths. The House of Windsor. It felt, even to them, as if a layer of distance had been peeled away. Yet the act was not without cost. Letters were dispatched to branches of the extended royal family across Europe, some of them bearing news more painful than the rest. German titles held by British relatives were to be renounced or anglicized. The Battenbergs became Mountbattens. Old coats of arms were set aside. Centuries of carefully woven dynastic threads were snipped, one by one, to keep the main fabric from tearing. In private, George V felt each cut. Whatever the public believed, he knew his own loyalties. He had never doubted that his place, his duty, his identity were rooted in Britain. But blood, once a source of security, had become a kind of accusation. On certain evenings, as he read reports from the front, he saw not only the red lines of battle on maps, but also family names scattered on both sides. Cousins facing each other across no man's land, not as kin, but as enemies. At Windsor Castle itself, life went on under the new banner that had risen from its stones. One afternoon, a young boy raced along a corridor, his footsteps echoing off the paneled walls. He was fair-haired, quick, with a restless energy even in such constrained surroundings. This was Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. He skidded to a halt when he saw his father standing near a window, staring out over the lawns. "Papa," Edward said, out of breath, "they say we have a new name. Is it true?" George turned, studying his son's eager face. How could he explain centuries of history and the weight of war in a way a boy would understand? "It is true," he said at last. "We are Windsor now." Edward smiled. "I like it," he said. "Sounds strong." The king nodded, but part of him wondered what that strength would mean for his children. Would they grow up thinking a name could be changed whenever the world demanded it? Would they see the crown as something eternal, or as something that must constantly adapt to survive? The questions had no easy answer, but they lingered all the same. Elsewhere in the castle, Queen Mary supervised the rearrangement of certain portraits and objects. It was not that she wanted to erase the past. She simply knew that the story they told needed to be clearer now. English landscapes were given pride of place. Paintings of Windsor's own history, its sieges, its royal weddings, its pageantry, were moved where visitors would see them first. The castle itself became a kind of argument in stone. This is who we are. This is where we come from. Beyond the walls, the war ground on, indifferent to heraldry. Men still fell in fields far from home. Families still received telegrams that began with the same dreadful formality. A new name could not stop shells. It could not heal wounds or rebuild shattered homes. But it could do something more subtle. It could keep a fragile trust alive. In Parliament, some were cynical. "Cosmetic," one politician muttered in a smoky corridor. "Paint on old wood." Others saw it differently. "Symbols matter," an older member replied. "If the people feel the king stands with them, they stand with him. Sometimes that feeling hangs on a word." The House of Windsor was, in truth, not born in an instant. It was hammered into shape by fear, by necessity, by the recognition that survival in the modern world required more than inherited titles. It required an understanding of perception, of image, of what names whispered in the minds of millions. As the war drew slowly toward its bloody end, the new name settled into ordinary speech. Children sang songs about King George of Windsor. Newspapers printed it without comment. Coins would eventually bear it. What had once seemed radical became normal, then obvious, as if it had always been so. But beneath that surface calm, currents shifted. A young generation of royals grew up with Windsor as their unquestioned identity. They would carry it into a future where the old certainties, about class, empire, and unquestioned deference, would erode under the pressure of change. One day, one of them would stand at a microphone and choose his heart over his crown, testing how far that carefully forged name could bend before it broke. For now, though, the House of Windsor stood newly baptized in wartime. The guns still roared across the channel. The city still darkened its lights at night. And behind the palace walls, a family who had changed their name to save their throne had no way of knowing that their greatest trials were not in the bombs falling from the sky, but in the storms that would one day erupt from within. In the years that followed the armistice of 1918, the noise of war faded, but it did not disappear. It lingered in the silence at dinner tables where a chair remained empty, in the shadows under the eyes of men who had seen too much. London tried to dress its wounds with light. Dance halls filled. Jazz spilled out of open doors. Young men and women staggered between laughter and weariness, as if unsure which belonged to them now. Within this restless peace, the House of Windsor began to settle into its new skin. King George became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of steadiness. He was not glamorous, not charming in an effortless way, but he was there, visiting factories, opening hospitals, presiding over ceremonies that stitched together a country still counting its dead. His speeches were careful, measured. His uniforms fit him like a second truth. He did not pretend the world had not changed, but he also did not invite change faster than people could bear. If the king was the anchor, his eldest son was the sail. Edward, Prince of Wales, stepped into the 1920s like a man stepping onto a lit stage. He visited battlefields turned into memorials, walking among crosses and wreaths with a bowed head. Crowds surged around him wherever he went, cheering the young man who, unlike his father, shook hands easily and laughed with a kind of boyish relief. Newspapers adored him. They printed photographs of him in uniform, in evening dress, on horseback. To many, he seemed the living proof that the monarchy could be both modern and familiar. He toured the empire that was already beginning to fray at its edges. In India, in Canada, in Australia, people lined roads to catch a glimpse of him. "He looks like one of us," a farmer in New South Wales said, watching the prince grin beneath the fierce sun. "Not some distant figure on a stamp." In these moments, the fragile bond between crown and subjects, tested by war, strained by change, seemed to strengthen. At Windsor Castle, servants grew used to hearing the prince's quick footsteps on the stairs, his voice calling across corridors, his impatience with stillness. He loved speed, fast cars, fast planes, the feeling of outrunning something he could not quite name. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand on a terrace and look out at the dark line of the hills, the wind tugging at his hair. The castle behind him was centuries of stone. The future in front of him was unbuilt, uncertain, waiting. George watched his son with both pride and unease. In quiet conversations with trusted advisers, the king would sometimes fall silent when the subject of the heir arose. Edward's popularity was undeniable, so was his restlessness. "The people love him," someone would say. "That must be enough." George would nod, but his jaw would tighten. He knew that love from the crowd was not the same as strength in private. The crown did not only require charm. It required endurance, sacrifice, an acceptance of duty so complete it could crush a man who did not truly want it. The king's own health began to fail as the 1920s gave way to the early 1930s. The strain of war and the weight of responsibility, carried year after year, wore him down like stone under water. Coughs lasted longer. Fatigue clung more stubbornly. Yet he kept to his routines, believing that small acts of constancy, reading the red dispatch boxes, meeting ministers, appearing on balconies for national days, held more power than grand gestures. Meanwhile, the name Windsor had become part of the air itself. Children in school recited it as if it had always been there. Queen Victoria of the House of Windsor, some of them wrote by mistake in essays, Folden. The new identity backward into the past without even realizing it. In shop windows, souvenirs bore the castle's outline with the royal family's faces nestled inside, like guardians of an ancient fortress. The act of reinvention, once radical, had melted into the background of ordinary life. But history does not move in a straight line. Beneath the surface, new pressures gathered. The Great Depression swept across continents, flattening fortunes and hope alike. In Britain, unemployment queues lengthened. Men stood in line with collars turned up against the wind, clutching caps in calloused hands, waiting for work that did not come. Newspapers showed photographs of hunger marches, of faces hardened by disappointment. The idea of monarchy, of opulence, of palaces and jewels, felt further than ever from the cold pavements under their feet. The Windsors tried to bridge that distance. Royal visits to poor areas were arranged. Photographs of the king and queen talking to workers and their families appeared in print. Yet there were murmurs now that did not exist before, conversations in union halls and at kitchen tables. What exactly was the monarchy for? Did a changed name make any difference to a man who could not feed his children? In drawing rooms, the tone of the conversations was different, but the questions echoed faintly. Politicians debated the role of the crown in a modern constitutional system. Could it remain above politics while the world below grew more divided? Could it maintain its mystique in a time when newspapers and radios carried every public word, every visible expression, into millions of homes? In January 1936, as winter lay heavy over the country, the man who had steered the monarchy through war and reinvention lay in a bedroom at Sandringham, his breath shallow. The room was quiet except for the soft rasp of lungs that had done their duty for too long. Photographs of his family sat on a bedside table. Outside, the bare branches of trees tapped slowly against the window glass, as if the world itself were waiting. George V died as a king who had transformed a royal house to save it. Messages of mourning went out across the empire, carried by radio waves crackling in the cold air. In cities and villages, people stopped what they were doing to listen to bulletins. Flags were lowered, churches filled. For many, the loss felt like the end of something steady in a world that had already known too much instability. In London, black crape appeared on doorways. At Buckingham Palace, the royal standard was hauled down and replaced with a flag that acknowledged a new reality. There was a new king now. Edward VII. He stood at a window in the palace, looking out at the familiar sweep of the Mall, its bare trees lined like sentries. The weight of the crown he had not yet formally received seemed to press on him already, invisible but heavy. Below, he could see a small cluster of people gazing up at the building, waiting for signs, for movement, for reassurance. They did not know the restlessness he carried like a second heartbeat. They did not see the private letters, the secret smiles shared in drawing rooms far from official cameras. They did not hear the quiet voice in his own mind whispering that duty and happiness might be pulling him in opposite directions. The House of Windsor had been forged in war, reshaped to survive the fury of guns and the suspicion of a nation. Now, as the 1930s darkened and storm clouds gathered once more over Europe, it was about to face a different kind of crisis, one born not from enemy planes, but from the desires of a single man at the very center of the crown. In the stillness of that winter afternoon, with the city holding its breath, the new king turned away from the window and stepped deeper into the rooms where history waited for him, unknowing that his choices would bring the House of Windsor to the brink of a scandal it had never imagined. In the weeks after George V's death, the rituals of mourning unfolded with practiced solemnity, yet beneath them, something trembled. Crowds lined the route of the funeral procession, their breath misting in the cold, their shoes crunching on frost-hardened ground. Black horses pulled the gun carriage bearing the coffin, the royal standard draped over it like a final, heavy sentence. Church bells tolled in slow, unrelenting rhythm. In the silence between each note, you could almost hear what people did not say aloud. We have lost the king who saw us through war, who gave us Windsor instead of a name that no longer fit. Inside Westminster Hall, where the coffin lay in state, the line of mourners stretched and coiled hour after hour. Some bowed deeply. Others just stood for a moment, eyes fixed on the crown resting atop the flag before moving on. An elderly man, his coat too thin for the chill, whispered under his breath, "Saw him once in the trenches, I did. Came to see the lads, didn't look like a foreigner then." The woman. Beside him, a stranger nodded. She didn't need to know the details. The feeling was enough. The House of Windsor had achieved what it needed to in that first trial by fire. It had convinced the people that it belonged to them. But as Edward VII stepped fully into his father's place, the balance began to shift. He was not his father. The differences were visible in the cut of his suits, in the easy way he leaned on balcony railings, in the way he looked at cameras not as intrusions but as companions. He spoke to the microphone as though to a friend, his voice lighter, less formal. For a public weary of solemnity, this felt like a breeze in a stale room. Yet those who worked closest to him sensed another wind blowing. At dinners with ministers, Edward's attention wandered when policy was discussed. He was more animated when the conversation turned to music, to travel, to the people he had met on his tour, particularly one woman whose name, at first, was just another detail in an anecdote, Mrs. Wally Simpson, American, sharp-eyed, witty, married. In private, letters crossed oceans and borders, written in a hand that grew more urgent over time. Phrases like, "I cannot imagine life without you," and "they do not understand us," etched themselves into paper that would one day be preserved as evidence of a crisis no one yet imagined in full. In the offices of government, advisers whispered behind closed doors. The Archbishop of Canterbury furrowed his brow over reports of the king's attachment to a woman whose situation, divorced and seeking a second divorce, clashed violently with the church's teachings and with the expectations placed on a sovereign. "This cannot end well," one senior figure murmured to another. "The crown is not a private possession. It is not something he can shape entirely to his own desires." At Windsor Castle, the very stoneheart of the name the family now bore, the tension became almost physical. The ancient walls seemed to listen as conversations unfolded in low voices. In one room, a valet carefully laid out the king's clothes while two footmen exchanged a glance. "Have you heard?" one asked softly. "About Mrs. Simpson, everyone's heard." "Do you think he'd?" The other shrugged. "He's not his father. Maybe he thinks rules bend for him." In another wing, a young Princess Elizabeth walked down a corridor holding her sister Margaret's hand. She was 10 years old, serious and observant, taking in more than adults realized. When they passed a pair of courtiers talking in hushed tones, she caught only a few words: American, divorce, dangerous, but the air around those words felt charged. She looked up at a portrait of her grandfather, George V., hanging in a gilded frame. His gaze, steady and slightly stern, seemed fixed on a point beyond the present moment, as if he already knew what storm was gathering. The name Windsor had been chosen to shield the monarchy from the hatred aimed at Germany during war. It had worked, but a name, no matter how strong, could not shield it from itself. In the clubs of London, amid the clink of glasses and the murmur of privileged conversation, men spoke with a mix of fascination and dread. "If the king insists on marrying her," one aristocrat said, "there will be a constitutional crisis." Another replied, "Constitutions can be bent. The question is, will the country bend with him?" Beyond those polished rooms, in pubs where the wallpaper peeled and the tables were scarred with old initials, ordinary people heard the rumors too. Some shrugged. "If he loves her, why shouldn't he?" Others stiffened. "A king ain't like the rest of us." That's the point, isn't it? The monarchy's greatest strength and weakness lay exposed in that contradiction. It had to be human enough to be loved, but not so human that its flaws shattered the illusion of something higher. Within the heart of the House of Windsor, the struggle sharpened into a single, brutal line of choice: crown or love. The king who bore the new name, forged in the fires of 1917 to make the monarchy feel more British, more rooted, more secure, was now contemplating a step that could undo that careful work in a single gesture. The same public that had accepted a name change as an act of solidarity might soon be asked to accept something far more radical: a sovereign willing to abandon the throne rather than abandon the woman he loved. On a quiet evening, Edward stood once more at a window, this time in Fort Belvedere, his private retreat near Windsor. The fields beyond were dark, the outline of the castle faint against the horizon. That castle gave the family its name, its sense of permanence. Yet in his chest, the permanence felt thin as paper compared to the pull of his own heart. If George V had remade the family's identity to save the crown from external threat, Edward now faced an internal one he had helped create. The House of Windsor had survived war. It had survived suspicion. Now it was poised on the edge of something more intimate and more dangerous: scandal. As he turned away from the window, footsteps echoing in the quiet house, the future of the monarchy shifted again. This time not under the impact of bombs or the roar of artillery, but under the weight of a single man's decision. The name forged in war was about to be tested in love. In the end, the story of the name seemed, on the surface, to have a simple ending. By the mid-1930s, schoolchildren could recite the line without hesitation: "The British royal family, the House of Windsor." History books, newly printed, carried the word as if it had always been there. In some, the old name, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, appeared only as a footnote, a curiosity that students skimmed past on their way to exam topics that seemed more urgent: treaties, battles, revolutions. The act of reinvention that had once felt like a gamble had become part of the furniture of national life. Solid, unremarked, taken for granted. But history rarely leaves its turning points that neat. In a cramped office near Whitehall, a civil servant named Arthur Hume shuffled through files one rainy afternoon, preparing briefings on the imperial question: how to hold together a far-flung empire in an era of rising nationalism. As he turned a page, his eyes caught on a line in a memorandum about the role of the crown as a unifying symbol. He sat back in his chair, listening to the patter of rain on the window, and thought about how much rested on that notion of a symbol. If the crown was a symbol, then everything that touched it, names, marriages, gestures on balconies, photographs in newspapers, became part of its meaning. A symbol could be strengthened, he knew, by small acts of wisdom. It could also be shattered by a single moment of perceived betrayal. He closed the file and stared for a long moment at a small framed photograph on his desk. George V in uniform, the word Windsor captioned below in neat type. "Forged in war," Arthur murmured to himself. The phrase sounded right, but he knew, as all who worked behind the scenes knew, that metal forged under intense heat is both strong and brittle. It resists pressure until it doesn't. In a terraced house in Manchester, a woman named Elsie stitched buttons onto a child's coat as the wireless crackled in the corner. The announcer spoke of the young and vigorous King Edward, of the promise of a new reign for a new age. Her little son, sitting on the floor with a tin toy soldier, asked, "Mum, is he a Windsor too?" "Yes," she replied without looking up, "same as the old king." "Then he's all right," the boy said, satisfied. "He's one of us." She smiled faintly. The idea had seeped in deep. Windsor meant ours, not foreign, not distant, not like them. She did not know about the conversations in palaces or the memos in Whitehall. She did not know about Wallis Simpson or the tension that threaded through high offices like a pulled wire. She only knew that a name had come to stand for continuity in a life that had seen too much upheaval. In the quiet of a palace library, a different understanding flickered in the lamplight. Queen Mary, now a widow, sat in an armchair with a letter open in her lap. The slant of the handwriting was familiar. The words were not. She read her son's phrases of longing, his declarations of love for a woman whose presence had already stirred dismay in the corridors of power. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes did not soften. She had given her life to the idea that monarchy meant duty before self always. The memory of 1917 flashed through her mind. The discussions, the signatures, the sacrifice of heritage and titles to protect the crown. "We changed a name to save this," she thought, "and now you would risk it for this." A log in the fireplace shifted, sending up a brief shower of sparks that danced and died. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed the hour, as steady and indifferent as ever. For Princess Elizabeth, the tides moving around her were felt only in fragments. A slightly strained silence when certain people were mentioned. The hurried way conversations changed when she entered a room. The sense that the grown-up world was wrestling with something that did not yet have a name she could grasp. She walked through Windsor's echoing halls with her sister, playing games among portraits of kings and queens who had faced wars, plagues, uprisings. None of those painted faces hinted at what was coming, a king who would choose to step down. If the forging of the House of Windsor had taught one lesson, it was this: the monarchy could change its outward form to survive. It could alter a title, reshape its story, present a new face to the people when the old one became untenable. But beneath that adaptability, the core demand remained the same: absolute loyalty to the institution above all personal desires. Edward VIII was about to test how far that core could bend. On a chill evening in London, fog curled in from the river, softening the edges of buildings and muffling footsteps on pavement. In a small pub near Fleet Street, journalists clustered around tables, their voices low but intense. Some spoke of cabinet rumors, of letters exchanged between the king and the prime minister, of private meetings at Fort Belvedere. Others shook their heads. "If this ever becomes public," one said, tapping ash into a tray, "it'll make the name change look like a footnote." "People like him," another replied. "They might forgive him anything." "Not anything," came the quiet answer. The wireless would soon carry a king's voice across the nation, speaking words unlike any ever uttered by a British sovereign. But for the moment, the story moved in murmurs and hints, in raised eyebrows and unfinished sentences. Back at Windsor, the castle's great towers stood dark against a cloudy sky. The flag fluttered, as it always did, bearing the arms of a monarchy that had survived battles, conspiracies, and wars. The stones that had given the royal house its new name were indifferent to the dramas of human hearts. They had seen generations come and go. They would stand when all the current actors were gone. Inside, however, in rooms lit by shaded lamps and watched over by portraits of George V and Queen Victoria, the human drama was tightening into a crisis. The name Windsor had once been a shield, a way to say to a wounded people, "We are not them, we are you." Now that shield was about to be tested not by foreign accusations, but by a question that cut to the heart of monarchy itself. Is a king a man first, or a symbol first? The answer, when it came, would shake the institution down to its foundations. And as Edward paced the floor of his retreat, letters from Wallis folded neatly on his desk, the echoes of 1917 hung around him like a ghost. A different king, in a different war, had set aside a name to preserve the crown. He was about to consider the opposite, setting aside the crown to preserve his own name joined with hers. The House of Windsor, once forged in war, was about to be reforged in scandal. Love, abdication, and the king who walked away. The story, when people later tried to simplify it, often began with a single image. A king and a woman walking together in a garden, their heads bent close, their laughter private. But long before anyone saw them as a pair, their paths were moving toward each other through very different worlds. He was born into ceremony. Edward, Prince of Wales, had grown up under vaulted ceilings and painted ceilings, watched by footmen who seemed part of the furniture, and by a public that saw him as a promise. As a young man, he had stood in uniform at the front lines during the First World War, the mud of France on his boots, the smell of gunpowder lingering in his clothes. He had seen the broken bodies, the faces of boys not much younger than himself. That experience left him with two contradictions: a real affection for ordinary people, and a deep dislike of the restraints that came with his own role. She was born into uncertainty. Bessie Wallis Warfield, later Wallis Simpson, came from Maryland, far from the gray skies of London. Her childhood was marked by money that came and went, by marriages that began with hope and ended in bitterness. By the time she arrived in England in the early 1930s, she carried with her a sharp intelligence, a quick tongue, and a hard-won belief that charm was a shield in a world that did not always offer protection. Their worlds intersected first in drawing rooms that smelled of cigar smoke and polished wood. The Prince of Wales moved through those rooms like a restless star, attracting attention without seeming to try. Wallis, introduced as the wife of an American businessman, watched him with an amused, measuring eye. At first, she was simply part of a larger circle, one more face in a crowd that the prince used to escape the stiffness of official life. But something in her dry humor, in the way she was not easily impressed, caught his attention. In the beginning, their conversation was light. They mocked small absurdities of court life. They shared jokes at the expense of stiff guests and tedious ceremonies. For a man weary of deference, her refusal to fawn over him felt almost intoxicating. "You're impossible," she told him once after some impulsive remark. "That's why I like you," he replied. Around them, the House of Windsor continued its steady performance of duty. George V still reigned, and the routines of monarchy, investitures, garden parties, state visits, unfolded as they had for decades. The name Windsor had done its work, soothing old anxieties about foreignness. The crown seemed secure. Yet in quiet corners of London society, observant eyes began to notice a pattern. Wallis was present more often when the prince appeared. Their laughter grew more private. Gifts were exchanged. Invitations multiplied. Servants, whose work allowed them to see without being seen, watched tea. He subtle change in how the prince's gaze followed her across a room. Inside Buckingham Palace, Queen Mary felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen flirtations before. She understood that her son, impatient with ceremony, sought relief in company that made him feel alive. But this was different. Wallis was not just clever, she was married, and rumor whispered that a second divorce might be on the horizon. For a future king, entanglement with such a woman was not simply unwise, it was dangerous. Mary spoke to Edward with the calm firmness she had used since his childhood. In a sitting room lined with books, she faced him across a small table, her hands resting on the carved arms of her chair. "You must be careful," she said. "You cannot treat your life as if it were a private affair. It belongs in part to the nation." He smiled, the charming, boyish smile that had disarmed so many. "Mother, you worry too much. People like her. She understands me." "This is not about whether she understands you," Mary replied, her eyes steady. "It is about what is possible. A king cannot marry a twice-divorced woman." He looked away, toward the window where the winter light lay pale on the glass. "Perhaps the rules must change," he murmured. For Mary, the words were like a chill. In the offices of government, the situation was observed with growing concern. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin heard reports from various sources: ambassadors, discreet civil servants, private citizens who felt compelled to mention what they had seen. The pieces formed a troubling picture. This was not a passing interest. It was becoming central to the king's life. By the time George V died and Edward took the throne, the relationship between the new king and Wallis was no longer a rumor. It was an open secret among those who watched the court closely. Yet the wider public knew almost nothing. Newspapers, bound by both law and a deeply embedded sense of deference, kept their front pages focused on official duties, not personal entanglements. Still in the background, tension coiled tighter. At Fort Belvedere, Edward's beloved retreat, the air felt different. Staff noticed that when Wallis was expected, the mood of the house changed. Flowers were arranged with extra care. Meals were planned with her preferences in mind. Her laughter drifted down corridors that had once echoed with the voices of kings and ministers. One evening, they sat together near a fireplace, the glow turning the room into a cocoon of warmth against the cold outside. Flames reflected in the glass of framed photographs on the mantel, George V in uniform, Queen Mary in pearls, Edward as a boy in sailor suit. The line of Windsor seemed to watch them. "Do you ever wish you were just an ordinary man?" Wallis asked, her voice low. "Every day," he answered without hesitation. "If I were, we wouldn't have to hide. We wouldn't have to worry about what anyone thinks." She studied him for a moment. "You're not ordinary," she said. "You never will be. That's the problem and the gift." He reached for her hand. "What if I refused to choose?" he said. "What if I decided to have both, the crown and you?" She did not answer right away. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the distance, the outline of Windsor Castle stood against the night, a darker shape in the darkness, the fortress that had given his family its name, the symbol of permanence that now framed a love story threatening to break its own rules. If the House of Windsor had been forged to survive external enemies, it now faced an internal conflict that could not be bombed or blamed away. It could only be solved by a choice that no one, not even those who had changed the royal name in 1917, had truly prepared for. A king, a woman, a crown. Only two of the three could remain together. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between public ceremony and private longing, the clock of history ticked toward a decision that would shake the monarchy to its core. The first real fracture appeared not in a palace chamber, but in a quiet office lined with shelves of leather-bound Acts of Parliament. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin sat behind his desk, fingertips pressed together, listening to a senior aide recount the latest developments. Wally Simpson had begun divorce proceedings. The words hung in the room like a mist of gunpowder waiting for ignition. Baldwin closed his eyes briefly. "So the king intends to continue?" he asked. "He does more than that," the aide replied. "He speaks of her as though she were already his wife." Baldwin sighed, a soft, tired sound. He reached for a document on the edge of his desk, a memorandum prepared after consulting the governments of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. All agreed on the same point. A twice-divorced woman with 2 living former husbands could not be queen. He looked out the window at the muted afternoon light. Rain streaked down the glass, blurring the outlines of Whitehall. "The crown," he murmured, "is not merely a personal possession. It belongs to the people, and they will not accept this." Yet even as he spoke those words, Baldwin knew there was another truth. The people adored Edward. They saw in him the promise of a new era, one less stiff, more human. The risk lay not only in the scandal itself, but in how the nation might react if forced to choose between their king and the institution he embodied. Meanwhile, in the sitting rooms of London's elite, speculation ripened into dread. At one such gathering in Belgravia, a retired ambassador sipped tea while speaking in a voice sharpened by anxiety. "If he insists on marrying her, he will place the entire monarchy in jeopardy. The name Windsor was meant to anchor us. But he behaves as though the crown is just another ornament he can rearrange on a mantle." A marchioness set down her teacup with a faint clink. "He is in love," she said softly. "Love," the ambassador replied, "is not the problem. Sovereignty is." Indeed, sovereignty, abstract to many, visceral to few, was precisely what Edward seemed increasingly unwilling to bear. At Fort Belvedere, the king paced before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his steps quick and tense. Wally sat on a sofa nearby, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. "I met with Baldwin," Edward said abruptly. "He insists the government will resign if I marry you. He speaks of crisis, of duty. He talks as though I am not a man, only an emblem." Wally's watched him. "And what are you?" she asked. He stopped pacing. "Both. Why can't I be both?" She gave a small, sad smile. "Because they won't allow it." He moved to sit beside her. "Then I shall marry you anyway. If they prefer crisis, let them have it." She shook her head. "Edward, if you defy them, they will break you. They will break us." A log collapsed in the grate, sending sparks upward. The room seemed to contract around them, a small island of light in a world that was swiftly darkening. He reached for her hand. "What would you have me do? Give you up?" The silence that followed was long and heavy. In Buckingham Palace, Queen Mary felt the crisis tightening like a band of iron around the family. She had seen monarchs fall in Europe, her cousins, the Romanovs, murdered in a cellar in Russia, the German and Austrian empires collapsing in the chaos of war. She knew better than anyone how fragile a crown could be. One afternoon, she summoned Edward. They met in a sitting room furnished with the calm order of a life built on discipline. She did not stand when he entered, nor did she soften her expression. "You cannot marry her," she said simply, "not as king." Edward sat opposite her, leaning back slightly, his posture almost defiant. "I love her, and the people will understand." Mary's eyes were steady. "The people know nothing. They have seen only the surface. They do not know what this would mean." He looked away. "Perhaps it is time they understood." "No," she said sharply. "It is time you understood. You were not born for yourself. You were born for the crown. It is the burden and the privilege of your position." He met her gaze again. "And what of happiness? Does that matter?" "For a king," she answered, "duty must matter more." Later, in the quiet of his private rooms, Edward read letters from Wally's, letters he carried with him, folded carefully, their edges worn. The handwriting curved across the page with a mixture of affection and uncertainty. She did not urge him to abdicate. She did not ask him to choose her over the crown, but her words revealed a woman trapped in a storm she had not entirely meant to summon. His hands trembled as he held the pages. Outside, the branches of leafless trees scratched against the windows, the winter wind rising. The storm inside the House of Windsor had reached its breaking point. Newspapers remained publicly silent, still obeying the unwritten rule of not publishing personal rumors about the monarch, but in private, editors debated how long they could hold the line. Foreign press outlets had already begun printing the story. Ships brought American papers across the Atlantic carrying headlines that, once seen, could not be forgotten. In working-class districts, wireless sets buzzed with speculation. People pieced together scraps of rumor, the king spending Christmas with company, a woman whose name had begun to surface in overseas reports. Some were sympathetic, others were furious, most were bewildered. In Parliament, MPs murmured in hallways, their words tinged with disbelief. The monarchy had weathered wars, crises, and political reforms, but could it survive a love affair? The question that hung over Britain was no longer whether the House of Windsor was British enough, as it had been in 1917. It was whether it could endure a king who placed personal desire above national duty. By December 1936, the crisis had sharpened into an unambiguous choice. Edward knew. Baldwin knew it, Queen Mary knew it. Even Wallis understood it. And so, one evening, Edward sat alone at a desk, pen in hand, staring at a sheet of official paper with words already drafted at the top. I, Edward VIII. The fire crackled faintly behind him. Shadows moved along the walls, long and solemn. He had not yet begun to write, but the moment of choice had arrived. A king, a crown, and a love that asked too high a price. The pen hovered over the page, as if it weighed more than any crown. Edward sat very still, listening to the sounds that seeped into the quiet room at Fort Belvedere. A clock ticked with stubborn regularity. Somewhere, a door closed. Outside, the winter wind moved through the trees, the branches scratching softly against one another like whispers. The words at the top of the page were formal, impersonal. I, Edward VIII, of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Emperor of India. They did not sound like him. They sounded like the voice of history, the voice of office. But the next line, still unwritten, would be his alone. He thought of his father, George V., signing the proclamation that had turned their family into Windsor to save the crown during wartime. That act had been a surrender of one kind, giving up an old identity to protect the institution. Now, Edward faced the opposite, give up the institution itself to remain true to his love. He lowered the pen and began to write. By the time he finished, an instrument of abdication lay on the desk, its sentences clean and final. He would renounce the throne for himself and his descendants. The crown would pass to his younger brother, Albert, the Duke of York, a man who had never sought it, a man who stammered when he spoke in public, a man who would soon be asked to stand firm in a world that was already sliding toward war. The next day, in a quiet room at Buckingham Palace, 3 of his brothers joined him to sign as witnesses. The atmosphere was thick with something too heavy to name. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The scrape of chairs, the rustle of paper, the scratch of pens, these small sounds carried the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy. Afterward, Edward walked through the palace he would no longer rule. The corridors, lined with portraits and polished to a dull shine, seemed both familiar and strangely distant. Servants bowed as he passed, their eyes flickering with a mixture of sorrow and confusion. How did one address a king who was, in a matter of hours, not a king? That evening, the people heard his voice. Families gathered around wireless sets in city flats and country cottages, in pubs and barracks. The warm hum of the radio filled rooms that smelled of tobacco, stew, or damp coats. Static crackled, then cleared, and Edward began to speak. "At long last," he said, "I am able to say a few words of my own." His voice was steady, but under the smoothness there was a tremor, not of fear, but of emotion held in check. He spoke of his heavy responsibility, of how he had found it impossible to carry it out without the help and support of the woman I love. It was, in its way, as shocking as any bombshell headline. A king speaking, not of empire or duty, but of love as the decisive force in his life. In a terraced house in Liverpool, a woman wiped her hands on her apron and stood very still as the words rolled through the kitchen. Her husband frowned, listening. "He's giving it up," he said softly, "for her." Their teenage daughter stared at the wireless as if it might explain everything. "Can he do that?" she whispered. In a pub in Glasgow, men leaned closer to hear. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded slowly, as if they understood something in the choice, even if they could not imagine making it themselves. A few muttered that a king had no right to put his own heart above the nation. Others said, almost grudgingly, "Takes courage, that." At Windsor Castle, Queen Mary listened alone, her back very straight, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. His words were clear, carefully chosen. He did not blame anyone. He did not apologize for feeling as he did. But with every sentence, he stepped further away from the role she believed he had been born to fill. When the broadcast ended, silence flooded back into the room. The Queen closed her eyes only for a moment. Then she stood and walked to a window. Outside, the castle's towers rose steady against the dark. The name Windsor still stood. The crown still existed, but the man who had worn it for less than a year had just laid it down. In another part of the castle, a small girl with serious eyes was told the news in words chosen carefully for her age. Elizabeth, now 10, listened as her father tried to explain that her uncle would no longer be king, that he himself would soon put on the crown, and that one day, far in the future, it might come to her. She did not fully understand the politics, the church laws, the constitutional tension, but she did understand one thing: her world had changed. The future had shifted onto her father's shoulders and faintly onto her own. Albert, the Duke of York, became George VI. In the ceremony of accession, he stood with a stiffness born not of arrogance but of dread. His stammer lurked under every phrase, threatening to break his sentences into pieces. Yet he forced each word out, slow, careful, determined. Those listening heard not a natural orator, but something perhaps more powerful in that moment. A man who struggled, yet did his duty anyway. For a public unsettled by the shock of abdication, this quiet effort felt strangely reassuring. The crown, so recently shaken by one man's refusal to bend, now rested on the head of a man who bent himself to fit it. The House of Windsor had survived its first great scandal. It bore a scar now, a story that could never be fully untold, a king who walked away. But it also bore a new symbol of a different kind of strength: George VI, the reluctant monarch who would soon be called to lead his people through a war more terrible than the last. In Europe, clouds were gathering. In Germany, a new regime marched to the beat of its own harsh drums. In streets from Berlin to Rome, the air vibrated with slogans and marching feet. The peace that had followed the Great War was cracking. Within Windsor's stone walls, a shy, dutiful king tried on the weight of the crown in private moments, knowing that the next storm his family faced would not come from within, but from a world once again heading toward fire. The name forged in war, tested in love, was about to stand against war once more. The shock of abdication did not fade overnight. It seeped slowly into the bones of the country. In the weeks after Edward's broadcast, newspapers that had once held their tongues now printed what had long been whispered. Photographs of Wallis appeared beside stern editorials about duty and precedent. Some papers treated her like a villain, others like a tragic romantic figure, but all agreed on one fact: a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. In small towns, the mood was mixed. In a Yorkshire village post office, a postmistress sorted letters beneath a framed portrait of the king that had been hastily replaced with the face of George VI. A customer, collecting his pension, glanced up at it and shook his head. "I like the other one," he muttered. "Seemed more alive." The postmistress replied quietly, "A king's not meant to be exciting, he's meant to stand." In London, office workers resumed their commutes, but conversations on buses and in queues kept circling back to the same question. What kind of monarchy did they want? One built on human feeling, or one built on unbending duty? Many wanted both, but the events of December 1936 had made it painfully clear that the Crown did not easily allow that combination. For Edward and Wallis, the price of their choice became real in exile. He sailed from Britain soon after signing the abdication document, watching the coastline recede into mist. The cold wind off the sea bit into his cheeks, but the sharper ache lay somewhere deeper, in the realization that he was leaving not just a country, but a role that had defined him from birth. He told himself, and others, that love made it worth it. Yet sometimes, standing alone on the deck, he felt the ghostly weight of the crown he no longer wore pressing faintly on him, like a phantom limb. They married in France, in a ceremony photographed from a distance. There were no brothers in attendance, no mother, no niece with solemn eyes. The House of Windsor did not come to witness the man who had once been its king marry the woman for whom he had given it up. Their union, so central to the crisis, now existed on the margins of the royal story, both inescapable and exiled. Meanwhile, in London and Windsor, George VI adjusted to the role that had been thrust upon him. He was not tall in presence like his brother, nor naturally at ease before crowds. His stammer was a constant enemy, turning public speaking into an ordeal. But if Edward had fled from duty, George approached it like a steep hill he would climb one step at a time, regardless of how much it hurt. He sought help: speech therapists, practice sessions, repeated readings. He worked at his weakness with a dogged determination that those watching him came to respect. In private, he confided his fears to his wife, Elizabeth, who stood at his side with both warmth and an iron belief that he could rise to the task. "You may not have wanted this," she told him once, "but perhaps that is why you are right for it." To the public, his efforts were not fully visible. What they saw were moments: a slightly halting broadcast, a careful speech in Parliament, a figure on the balcony whose smile was less dazzling but more grounded. After the turbulence of the abdication, that steadiness, however hard one, began to calm something in the national mood. For the young Princess Elizabeth, the new arrangement reshaped her life in quiet but profound ways. Her father was no longer just Papa, he was king. With that shift came a new understanding of her own place in the line of succession. The girl who had once been a royal child among others was now, suddenly, heiress presumptive. Lessons took on a different tone. History was no longer just dates and battles. It was a pattern she might one day step into. Constitutional law, the workings of government, the expectations of a sovereign, these topics began to weave themselves into her education. She watched her father closely. She saw him struggle with words and master them. She saw the strain etched into his face after long days, the way he squared his shoulders before stepping into rooms filled with expectation. The abdication had left a scar, but it had also given her a living example of what it meant to choose duty even when every part of you might prefer a quieter life. The House of Windsor, still relatively new as a name, now bore two contrasting legacies within a single generation: the king who walked away and the king who stayed despite his fears. Beyond Britain, the world paid attention. Foreign leaders studied the crisis of 1936 with interest. Some saw weakness, a monarchy shaken by a romantic scandal. Others saw resilience, an institution that had survived a direct blow and managed to reconstitute itself around a new, more dutiful figurehead. In Germany, where Adolf Hitler was consolidating his power, British constitutional drama was merely one strand in a larger tapestry of opportunity and threat. Yet even there, Observers noted that the new king seemed less sympathetic to their regime than his brother might have been. As the late 1930s unfolded, attention slowly shifted from the echoes of abdication to the growing danger on the continent. Rearmament, annexations, marches and speeches broadcast from Berlin and Rome. The names of foreign cities slid once more into British newspapers, accompanied by photographs of troops, tanks, and cheering crowds. The memory of the Great War was still raw enough to make people flinch at the thought of another, but the signs were unmistakable. In September 1939, when Britain finally declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, the nation turned once more to the voice of its king. George VI sat in a small room, a microphone positioned before him like a black, watchful eye. He held the text of his speech in his hands, fingers steady but tense. Years of practice had brought him to this moment. The abdication crisis was behind him now, but it had shaped him, tempered him, forced him to confront his own weaknesses in a way that made this task possible. He began to speak. To listeners sitting in parlors, in barracks, in ships' cabins, and colonial outposts, the speech was not a polished oration delivered with effortless grace. It was something more human, a man pushing his way through the treacherous terrain of his own impediment to offer reassurance. Each word carried weight precisely because it had not come easily. Once again, the House of Windsor found itself at the center of a war that would test the endurance of the nation and the crown. The name forged in the fire of the First World War, tested by a king's refusal to bend to duty, now faced its greatest challenge yet: to stand firm as bombs fell, as cities burned, and as a young princess watched, learning in the harshest school what it truly meant to wear the weight of a crown. Outside, as the king's voice faded from the airwaves, the first air raid sirens began to wail. War duty and the young Elizabeth. When the sirens first began to wail over London in earnest, the sound carved itself into people's nerves. It started as a distant, rising moan, then swelled into a keening that filled streets and stairwells, creeping through cracks under doors. Mothers snatched up children. Shopkeepers flipped signs to closed with shaking hands. In the underground stations, footsteps thundered down stairways as crowds pressed toward the platforms, breathing in the smell of damp concrete, iron rails, and fear. Above them, the sky grew dangerous. Searchlights swung like pale swords through the darkness, their beams crossing and recrossing as if trying to stitch the night back together. The low drone of aircraft engines deepened, became a growl, then a roar. Then came the crump of explosions, dull at first, then closer, sharper, like the sky itself was breaking. For the second time in a generation, Britain was at war with Germany. This time, the bomber that gave the people nightmares did not carry the name Gotha that had helped force a royal house to rename itself. The Luftwaffe came under other emblems now. The enemy had changed uniform, flag, and leader. But the feeling in the streets was grimly familiar, a sense that the island was under threat, that the line between home and battlefield had dissolved. In Buckingham Palace, sandbags were piled against the walls. Windows were crisscrossed with tape. The great chandeliers in the state rooms were shrouded, their light dimmed. The palace had withstood the previous war unscarred. It would not be so lucky this time. George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to abandon London. Ministers suggested that they move permanently to Windsor or further north, away from the capital's obvious danger. The Queen's answer would become famous: "The children will not go without me. I will not go without the king, and the king will never leave." So they stayed. On some nights they stood on the palace roof, watching the glow of fire spreading through the city, listening to the thud of bombs landing in other districts. On other nights, they sheltered in the palace's own basement as explosions shook the walls. Once, when Buckingham Palace itself was hit, its chapel destroyed, windows blown inward, the Queen told those gathered in the rubble, "I am glad we have been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." It was not just a line, It was a bridge. In the smoking streets of the East End, where rows of terraced houses had been reduced to jagged shells, people felt something shift when they heard that the King and Queen's own home had not been spared. "They're catching it same as us," a dockworker said, staring at the ruins of his neighbor's house. "Maybe they do understand after all." The House of Windsor, once suspected of being too German, too distant, too insulated, now stood squarely in the blast zone with its people. In Windsor Castle, which lay outside the main target zone but within the reach of danger, the young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, lived in a carefully managed half-shadow of war. They had been moved there for safety, away from the heaviest bombing in London, but they were not sheltered from the knowledge that their country burned by night. The castle's ancient walls echoed with blackout instructions, air raid drills, and the distant rumble of guns. Windows were darkened. Corridors that had once hosted endless processions of courtiers and guests now felt quieter, more introspective. The girls' lessons continued: history, languages, constitutional law. But alongside them came new subjects: first aid, rationing, the mechanics of war whispered in grown-up conversations they half overheard. One autumn evening, Elizabeth stood at a narrow window looking out over Windsor's shadowed grounds. The lingering smell of dinner, soup, bread, something modest and ration-conscious, still clung faintly to her clothes. In the distance, toward London, a dull red glow pulsed against the clouds. It looked like a distant sunset that refused to die. She was 13. Her governess, Marion Crawford, stepped up beside her. "You should sleep," Crawfie said gently. Elizabeth did not take her eyes from the horizon. "Are they all right?" she asked. "In the East End, I mean." Crawford hesitated. "Many are not," she admitted, "but they are brave. The King and Queen see them often." Elizabeth nodded. She had seen the photographs in the papers, her parents standing amid rubble, talking to soot-streaked women whose eyes were tired but defiant. She felt a tug of something that would follow her all her life, a mixture of duty and protectiveness, a sense that somehow she was connected to those distant, unknown people. "I wish we could do something," she murmured. "You will," Crawford replied, "in time." Duty, for Elizabeth, was not a dramatic revelation. It did not descend on her in a single moment. It seeped in gradually through days like this, through the strain in her father's face after a broadcast, through the quiet grief of her mother visiting bombed-out streets, through the letters from soldiers and children that were read aloud in the evenings. In 1940, after France fell and the threat of invasion loomed, George VI's role as a symbol of resistance sharpened. His broadcasts on key occasions, such as the one at the beginning of the war and later during the darkest days, became points of emotional anchorage for millions. The British Expeditionary Forces evacuation from Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain fought in the skies overhead, the nightly terror of the Blitz. Through all of it, people looked not only to Winston Churchill's defiant speeches, but also to the quiet, steady presence of the King. For the House of Windsor, these were years of rigorous proving. The name that had once felt like a carefully crafted mask forged in 1917 now became something more like a vow. Windsor was not just a castle or a brand, it was an expectation. To bear it was to remain, to stand, to endure. As the war dragged on, Elizabeth's world broadened. In 1940, she made her first public radio address, broadcast from Windsor to children evacuated from cities to the countryside or abroad. Sitting before a microphone that seemed huge to her, she spoke with that clear, slightly preck. "Is a voice that would become famous. We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well." Somewhere in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, children far from home listened and felt, perhaps for the first time, that this girl, this future queen, was part of their story too. The House of Windsor was learning to use not just ceremony, but intimacy. The war dissolved distance. Radio carried voices into kitchens and air raid shelters. Newsreels showed images of the royal family visiting hospitals and bomb sites. The monarchy could no longer be only a distant figure on a horse at trooping the color. It had to become a familiar presence in times of fear. It was a lesson, not lost, on the young princess watching from Windsor's echoing corridors. Somewhere beyond the blackout curtains, beyond the howl of sirens and the punch of anti-aircraft guns, the future was forming. It would belong to her sooner than anyone yet imagined. The war changed rhythm in 1942. Britain was still battered, rationed, exhausted, but the early terror of invasion had eased, and in its place came a grinding endurance that wore on every household, from the terraced streets of London to the royal apartments of Windsor. The soundscape of daily life had shifted. Fewer sirens, more factory whistles, fewer explosions, more radio announcements of battles in places most citizens could barely locate on a map: Tobruk, Singapore, Stalingrad. In this long middle stretch of the war, Princess Elizabeth began to move from childhood into a role that felt increasingly like apprenticeship. Her father's burden was visible to her now in a way it hadn't been at the war's beginning. She saw how he paced before speeches, shaping each phrase. She saw how his shoulders drooped when he returned from a hospital visit or a bomb site. Sometimes, after long days, the king came to Windsor for a night's rest. On those evenings, Elizabeth would sit quietly beside him in a private sitting room, pretending to read while he studied dispatches. The lamplight made the lines on his face deeper, yet in his presence she always felt steadiness, an anchor in a world constantly tilting. One evening she asked him, "Does it ever feel too heavy?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Duty is heavy, Lilibet, heavier than anyone imagines, but it is also the thing that keeps me upright." She absorbed the words carefully. Years later, she would recall them during her own nights of sleepless responsibility. But at 13, 14, 15, she didn't simply hear her father. She studied him, almost as one studies the rules of a game one is destined to play. While the king carried the weight of leadership, Elizabeth began her own small contributions. In 1943, she was appointed colonel of the Grenadier Guards, her first official military role. The ceremony took place at Windsor, the crisp winter air sharp in her lungs as she stood before rows of soldiers. Their uniforms were immaculate, their boots gleaming, even in wartime. Elizabeth felt the familiar mix of shyness and resolve tightening inside her. "They will look to you," her mother had told her earlier. "Stand straight, speak clearly. They will forgive everything except uncertainty." So she stood straight-backed, her hair pinned neatly beneath her cap. When she gave her brief speech, her voice carried across the courtyard with a steadiness that surprised even her. The soldiers listened. They saluted. And in the quiet that followed, she felt something she had only glimpsed before, not pride exactly, but belonging. This was her father's world, and it was becoming hers. But the moment that changed her path from symbolic involvement to active participation came 2 years later. By 1944, the war had turned again. D-Day, the liberation of France, the tightening ring around Nazi Germany. The end was no longer an impossible dream. It was a distant shape on the horizon. Across Britain, women were filling roles once reserved for men: pilots of transport aircraft, code breakers at Bletchley Park, mechanics in uniform. Elizabeth needed to contribute. Her parents hesitated. She was heir to the throne. Her safety, her training, her image were carefully protected. But she argued quietly and persistently. If others her age were serving, how could she remain behind castle walls? At last, George VI agreed. In early 1945, Princess Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, training as a driver and mechanic. She wore khaki. She smeared her hands with grease. She learned to change tires, check spark plugs, dismantle engines. Her instructors treated her with respect but not with deference. "Do it again, ma'am," one told her when she fumbled a carburetor adjustment. She did. The other trainees whispered among themselves at first, astonished to find the future queen learning to operate a gearbox beside them. But soon the novelty faded. Elizabeth laughed with them during breaks, shared cigarettes she didn't actually smoke. ND worked with a seriousness that won their quiet admiration. In letters home, she described the smell of oil, the stubbornness of certain engines, the chill of early morning drills. "It is work," she wrote, "but it feels like real work." And in London, the newspapers took note. Photographs of her in uniform appeared next to stories of British advances on the continent. The image was powerful, the young princess doing her part, sleeves rolled up, unafraid of dirt. It countered the lingering suspicion, older than the Windsor name itself, that royalty lived too far from the hardships of ordinary people. One evening at Windsor, she came to dinner still smelling faintly of petrol. Margaret wrinkled her nose, the Queen raised an eyebrow, the King laughed softly. "A proper soldier," he said. But beneath his smile lay something deeper, relief. If Edward's abdication had nearly fractured the monarchy, Elizabeth's steady sense of duty was beginning, quietly, to mend it. The moment the war ended swept over the country like a tidal wave of breath finally released. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, crowds surged into the streets. Flags waved from windows. People danced, cried, kissed strangers, climbed lampposts, banged pots, rang bells. Light returned to London in the form of bonfires and floodlit monuments. The blackout curtains were torn down and thrown open. After 6 years of darkness, the city glowed. Elizabeth, now 19, stood on a balcony at Buckingham Palace with her family, looking down at the sea of faces stretching across the mall. The roar that rose up when the royal family appeared was like something alive, warm, deafening, jubilant. She felt the force of it hit her chest. Later that night, with permission she would laugh about for decades, Elizabeth and Margaret slipped into the crowds incognito, escorted by officers who stayed discreetly behind. For a few stolen hours, they walked among the people, arm in arm with strangers, laughing at sudden bursts of song, swept along in tides of joy. Someone handed Elizabeth a small Union Jack. She waved it, grinning, her identity unnoticed. She saw her parents appear again on the balcony, far above, and felt a strange split inside her, a girl celebrating freely among the crowds, and a future queen who belonged on the balcony. She felt the weight of both identities merging. In the months that followed, Britain began the exhausting work of rebuilding, bombed streets, shattered families, a nation worn thin by sacrifice but determined to rise again. And as rationing continued, as cities repaired, as soldiers returned home, the House of Windsor emerged from the war with something it had not possessed in 1917 or 1936. A sense of earned legitimacy. The crown had stood with its people. The king had spoken through fear, without fleeing it. The heiress had served under the same khaki as millions of others. Yet the victory's glow also cast long shadows. George VI's health had begun to fail. The strain of the war, the speeches, the tour, the constant pressure of being the symbol of national resistance, etched itself into his lungs, his heart, his posture. And Elizabeth, watching him closely, sensed that the season of her own ascension was approaching far sooner than she wished. The war had shaped her. But now another kind of test awaited, the transition from daughter to sovereign. The House of Windsor had survived the bombs. Now it would need to survive history's next upheaval, the end of empire, the rise of modern media, and the burdens of a crown moving from a father to a young woman who had never expected to inherit so soon. Peace did not arrive as a clean break. It seeped in gradually, like light through damaged curtains. In the years after 1945, Britain lived in a strange dual state, victorious and exhausted. Cities still bore the wounds of bombing. Streets ended abruptly in piles of rubble like sentences cut short. Food rationing continued. People queued for basics with the same patience they had learned in wartime, but now their thoughts drifted toward the future, toward promises of land fit for heroes, toward rebuilding, toward something better than just survival. For the House of Windsor, the transition was just as intricate. George VI, who had carried the crown through the threat of invasion and nightly raids, remained a figure of quiet stability. But the war had carved into his health. He coughed more often. His face, once merely serious, now seemed lined with a permanent fatigue. Doctors muttered about arteries, lungs, strain. He continued his duties regardless, moving through ceremonies and meetings with the same determined steadiness that had seen him through the war years. At his side, Princess Elizabeth moved fully into her role as the nation's future. In 1947, she and Philip Mountbatten were married, a union that would shape not only her private life, but also the image of the monarchy in a new age. Philip, tall, blunt, with restless energy and a background that tied him to Greek and Danish royalty, did not fit neatly into the image of a quiet British consort. But he brought with him a certain modern force, a naval officer's discipline, a wry humor, and a sense that the world could not remain as it had been before the war. Their wedding, held in Westminster Abbey, was both glittering and restrained. Britain was still under rationing. Elizabeth saved clothing coupons for her dress. The nation followed the detail with a mixture of pride and affection. In streets where bricks still lay in heaps, people pressed around shop windows to see photographs pinned up. The bride's long train, the uniforms and decorations, the balcony wave. For a country still limping toward recovery, the spectacle felt like a promise that beauty, ceremony, and continuity were not yet spent. For Elizabeth, beneath the veil and diamonds, the day carried a deeper weight. She was no longer just a dutiful daughter. She was now a wife, and soon the mother of children who would be born into a very different Britain, one where the empire that had once stretched across the globe was unraveling. India had already gained independence in 1947, the jewel in the crown slipping from its setting. Other colonies would follow. The royal family's role would have to transform from imperial rulers to constitutional figureheads within a commonwealth of equal nations. Elizabeth watched this shift unfold from her place near the center of power, taking in lessons with the same seriousness she had brought to her wartime service. Then, in 1952, the personal and the political collided. The king's health, long a matter of concern, worsened. He underwent surgery. He rested. But each public appearance showed a man diminished. Still, when Elizabeth and Philip embarked on a tour of Kenya and other parts of the Commonwealth early that year, there was hope he might yet recover some strength. The news reached her in a small, quiet place, a lodge in the Kenyan highlands. One morning, under a sky of hard, bright blue, she awoke as a princess and heiress. By evening, she was queen. A telephone call hushed voices, the sudden stillness in a room full of aides who had been busy moments before. Her father was dead. The crown, invisible but absolute, had moved to her. Accounts differ on the exact details of that moment, how long she stood silent, what she said first, but all agree on the expression that settled on her face, a composure that seemed too old for her 25 years. The years of war, the abdication scar, the endless lessons in duty had formed a foundation. Now, the full structure of monarchy would be built upon it. Back in London, black crepe reappeared on doorways. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace in scenes reminiscent of 1936, but the mood was different. Then, the shock had come from scandal. Now, it came from loss. The memory of the war was still close enough that many felt they had lost not just a king, but a companion in hardship. The coronation, the following year, would show how much the world and the Windsors had changed. In 1953, Westminster Abbey filled once more with robes, jewels, incense, and trumpets. But this time, the ceremony was carried far beyond those stone walls by a relatively new technology, television. For the first time, millions watched a coronation not as a filtered newspaper image or a newsreel played weeks later, but live in their own sitting rooms. Neighbors crowded into houses with sets. Curtains were drawn not to keep out bombs, but to cut glare from the screens. The image of Elizabeth, young, solemn, kneeling as the crown was placed upon her head, did more than mark the beginning of her reign. It reset the relationship between monarchy and people. The House of Windsor had become not only a national symbol, but a living broadcast. The television cameras lingered on the gold, the procession, the aged faces of peers and bishops, the glow of candles reflected on polished wood and polished jewels. They also lingered on Elizabeth's expression, a blend of seriousness, awe, and something like inward resolve. Those watching felt both the weight of tradition and the vulnerability of a young woman taking on an impossible task. The monarchy's power in law had diminished over the decades, its political role largely ceremonial, but its power in image had grown. The more the world saw, the more its expectations and judgments would shape the crown's survival. In the years that followed, Elizabeth became the steady heartbeat of a rapidly changing nation. Rock and roll, decolonization, the Cold War, youth culture, social revolutions, through all of it, she appeared on stamps and coins, at state openings and village fairs, at ship launchings and hospital openings. She shook hands, listened, nodded, and rarely, if ever, revealed what she truly thought. Privacy became her armor, impartiality her discipline. The House of Windsor under her leaned into the idea of duty as performance, flawless, continuous, uncomply. Ning. But beyond the polished balconies, cracks began to form. Television, which had once seemed a tool for strengthening the bond between monarchy and people, gave way to a more ravenous media environment. Tabloids grew bolder, cameras more intrusive. Public appetite shifted from ceremony to personality, from deference to curiosity. The same lens that had magnified the majesty of the coronation would, in time, magnify flaws and fractures. Within the family itself, pressures increased. Children grew up and married. Those marriages carried not just personal stakes, but institutional ones. The Windsors remained the face of tradition in a world that was steadily losing interest in old certainties. The young woman crowned in 1953 had promised, in a speech given years earlier on her 21st birthday, that her whole life, whether it be long or short, would be devoted to service. She kept that promise with unwavering consistency. But consistency alone could not protect the crown from a new kind of storm brewing on the horizon. Some decades later, another young woman would walk down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral in a shimmering white gown, watched by an even greater global audience than Elizabeth's coronation. She would be hailed as a fairy tale princess, adored by cameras that never blinked. And her story would set the House of Windsor on fire in ways that bombs and abdications never had. The age of duty was about to crash into the age of celebrity. The castle that had given the Windsors their name would soon, quite literally, burn. The 1980s arrived in Britain like a sudden change in weather, louder, brighter, faster than the decades before. Neon lights replaced the soft glow of old street lamps. Music pulsed from shops and passing cars. Television, once polite and limited, now spilled into every corner of life. Nothing, it seemed, was immune from the accelerating glare of public attention. Not even the monarchy. For a while, the crown stayed steady in its familiar orbit. Queen Elizabeth II, seasoned now, moved with the same careful grace through ceremonies and state occasions. Prince Charles, after years of searching for purpose beyond his title, devoted himself to charities, architecture, and environmental advocacy long before such concerns were fashionable. But the institution faced a growing problem, one it had not prepared for. The world no longer wanted distance from its royal family. It wanted proximity. It wanted access. It wanted drama. Into this new landscape stepped a 20-year-old nursery assistant named Diana Spencer, and the air around the House of Windsor changed instantly. She appeared first on the margins of photographs, a shy young woman in a skirt slightly too long, a sweater slightly too loose, her head bowed as she glided past reporters. But even with her downcast eyes, she radiated something unmistakable. A softness amid the marble, a vulnerability amid the steel of royal tradition. Charles had known her family for years. She was the younger sister of a woman he had once dated. But when he noticed Diana, he saw something he could not quite name, someone fresh, someone unmarked by the harshness of life in the spotlight. The public sensed it too, though they could not articulate why. They simply felt an instinctive pull toward her, as though she were a character stepping out of a storybook. The courtship was brief, under the relentless gaze of cameras. When the engagement was announced in 1981, Diana's face appeared everywhere, from newspapers to teacups, from posters in teenage bedrooms to shop window displays. Shy Di, the press called her, though the name said more about the fantasies projected onto her than about the woman herself. Elizabeth watched the unfolding frenzy with measured calm. She knew what the public expected from a future Princess of Wales: dignity, duty, grace. What she did not yet know, what no one knew, was how Diana's presence would reshape public imagination, and in doing so, reshape the monarchy itself. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral became an event beyond anything Britain had witnessed. More than 750 million people around the world watched Diana walk down the aisle in a dress of ivory silk and lace, its train billowing like a cloud behind her. Outside, crowds surged shoulder to shoulder, waving flags, shouting her name. For a day, the country felt wrapped in a spell of hope, spectacle, and impossible perfection. But fairy tales, when stretched over real people, eventually tear. Soon after the marriage, cracks began to appear quietly at first, then widening into unmistakable fractures. Charles, shaped by duty and a lifetime of scrutiny, drifted between expectation and inner longing. Diana, adored by the public, struggled inside an institution that offered fame but not refuge. Cameras followed her everywhere, capturing not just her triumphs but her loneliness, her exhaustion, her attempts to navigate a life measured in protocol and appearances. The monarchy, for all its traditions, had not prepared for someone like Diana, a woman who, simply by being herself, made the public feel something deeper than loyalty: identification. Crowds flocked to her hospital visits. They bought magazines to see what she wore. They replayed footage of her hugging children with AIDS at a time when fear and stigma dominated. She embodied compassion in a way that made the monarchy look, by contrast, distant and old. The more they loved her, the more the balance inside the family shifted. "We are a family," the Queen once told an aide, "but we are also an institution. It is not always easy to be both." The difficulties within the Wales marriage grew: arguments, silences, separate lives lived under the same gilded roof, and all the while the press sharpened its lenses. Paparazzi hid in hedges, on motorbikes, in vans with long-range cameras. Private phone conversations were leaked. Rumors turned into headlines. Headlines turned into narratives. Narratives turned into myths. By the early 1990s, the strain had reached a breaking point. In 1992, annus horribilis, as the Queen would later call it, the monarchy seemed to stagger under one blow after another. The marriages of 3 of Elizabeth's 4 children collapsed. A tell-all book about Diana revealed deep fissures in her marriage. Tabloid scrutiny intensified into something predatory. And then Windsor Castle caught fire. It began in the Queen's private chapel, when a spotlight exploded and ignited a curtain. Flames raced across centuries-old timbers. Smoke billowed into hallways, turning gilded corridors into choking tunnels. Firefighters battled the blaze for hours, hoses snaking across the grass, water pouring through shattered windows. Elizabeth watched with a stillness that unnerved those around her. This was not just a building. It was her home. It was the stone heart of the name her grandfather had chosen in 1917, the anchor of her family's identity. Seeing it burn felt like witnessing the crown itself under threat. And yet, even as flames licked at ancient walls, she stood with the firefighters, asking what needed saving first. Duty, even here, surrounded by smoke and collapsing beams, held firm. When the fire was finally contained and the cost of repairs became public, outrage erupted. Why should taxpayers pay to restore a royal residence, especially when the family's personal lives seemed to be falling into public turmoil? Under pressure, the Queen made decisions that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. She agreed to pay income tax, and the palace opened to the public in a new way, allowing tour revenue to contribute to restoration. The monarchy bent to survive. But bending is not the same as breaking. The true breaking point came later, in 1997, on a night in Paris. Diana, who had separated from Charles, who had tried to build a life beyond the palace's shadow, who remained beloved by millions, died in a car crash while being chased by photographers. The news struck the world like a physical blow. In London, people poured into the streets clutching flowers. Outside Kensington Palace, tributes piled into great mounds of color and scent. Many wept openly. Some shouted in anger at the press. Others, more quietly, turned their frustration toward the monarchy itself, asking why the Queen had not yet appeared, why the flag above Buckingham Palace did not fly at half-mast, why silence reigned when sorrow demanded acknowledgement. Elizabeth had retreated to Balmoral with her grandsons, William and Harry, believing that shielding them from the media was the right thing. But the public mood shifted quickly from grief to resentment. For the first time in her reign, the Queen sensed that the bond between monarchy and people was in danger of snapping. She returned to London. She spoke directly to the nation, as she had during the war years, acknowledging Diana's impact, the public's grief, and the Crown's responsibility to respond. Her voice, measured and composed, carried something rare: vulnerability. It worked. Slowly the anger softened. The flowers remained, the grief remained, but the crown held. The House of Windsor had endured a modern inferno: tabloid scrutiny, divorce, scandal, and the death of a woman who had become, in many ways, more iconic than the monarchy itself. Yet survival came at a cost. The monarchy was no longer a distant, untouchable symbol. It had been forced into the realm of emotion, of celebrity, of public expectation. And once that door opened, it could not be closed. Ahead lay a new century, new dangers, new transformations. And waiting within the family were two young princes shaped by the trauma of losing their mother, and destined to redefine the crown in ways no one could yet foresee. The turn of the millennium brought no pause, no quiet reset for the House of Windsor. It arrived like a long inhale after years of smoke, fresh, cold, deceptively calm. But beneath the surface, pressure continued to build. Britain was changing. The world was changing. And the monarchy, ancient, ceremonial, rooted in centuries of ritual, was being dragged into a digital era where nothing stayed private, nothing remained sacred, and nothing could be hidden for long. Yet before the crown could confront the turbulence of the new century, it needed to mend the fractures of the last one. The late 1990s and early 2000s became a decade of deliberate recalibration. Buckingham Palace shifted its style. It opened more doors, literally and figuratively. Press access expanded. The royal website launched. Public engagements increased in visibility and emotional tone. Where the monarchy had once expected deference, it now needed connection. Queen Elizabeth II, steady, disciplined, emotionally reserved, stepped carefully into this new landscape, never abandoning her core principles but quietly updating the institution around her. She embraced walkabouts in public conversations. She allowed cameras closer than any previous monarch would have tolerated. She learned to signal empathy not through speeches alone, but through small gestures that became symbolic: a bowed head, a worn expression, a carefully chosen word. Yet even with these adjustments, one truth lingered. The monarchy had been reshaped, perhaps permanently, by Diana's absence and by the two boys she left behind. William and Harry, now young men, carried a kind of collective national projection. People saw in them Diana's legacy, her warmth, her accessibility, her humanity. They saw in them a chance for renewal. But they also saw wounds. And wounds, unlike fairy tales, do not heal neatly. In those years, the relationship between father and sons was both loving and complicated. Charles, long miscast in the public imagination as the antagonist in Diana's story, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust with the nation and with his children. He was patient, deliberate, cautious. He kept his private emotions locked away, offering instead what he knew best, duty and consistency. William grew into a quiet, steady figure, aware that one day the crown would pass to him. Harry grew into something else, restless, empathetic, searching for a role that didn't come with a map. And while the Queen offered them both a kind of anchoring presence, the scars of loss pulsed beneath the surface. But before the dynamics of the younger generations could fully reshape the monarchy, one final, symbolic confrontation with the past arrived. The fire at Windsor Castle had been repaired. The monarchy had weathered the backlash. Yet the deeper flames, public scrutiny, celebrity culture, media intrusion, still flickered, threatening to reignite at any moment. The early 2000s revealed just how vulnerable the institution remained. In 2002, the Queen endured two profound losses: the death of her sister, Princess Margaret, and the death of her mother, the beloved Queen Mother. Two funerals in the span of weeks, two eras closing at once. Both women, in different ways, had buttressed Elizabeth, Margaret with her fierce loyalty and humor, the Queen Mother with her wartime symbolism and indomitable spirit. With their passing, Elizabeth stood more alone atop the institution than she had since the early years of her reign. And still the world kept turning. The media grew harsher. The internet shattered every barrier to rumor and speculation. Paparazzi cameras evolved into lenses that could capture a face from half a mile away. Celebrity culture exploded, and the monarchy, whether it liked it or not, was part of that ecosystem. In palaces and newspaper offices alike, one fact became unavoidable. The rules of the game had changed. Where the monarchy once operated in protected spheres, court protocols, controlled imagery, now its members lived in a constant digital spotlight. Every expression became a headline. Every slip became a meme. Every private moment risked becoming public. And as William stepped into adulthood, the nation began to see him as the future, poised, polite, bearing the calm presence of his grandmother. His relationship with Kate Middleton, a young woman from outside aristocracy, drew intense fascination. But unlike Diana's early years, the palace took a more protective, measured approach. Lessons had been learned. Boundaries had to be drawn. But while William and Kate walked a careful, steady path, Harry walked another. He felt the weight of his mother's legacy not as a gentle inheritance but as an ache. He admired her emotional openness. He understood her loneliness. And as he grew into a young man, he felt pulled between two identities. The soldier he wanted to be. The public figure he was expected to be. His deployment to Afghanistan offered him something rare, purpose. But it also revealed how impossible it was for him to separate his identity from the crown. When his presence became a security risk, he was pulled from the front. And that event, small in the grand sweep of history, lit a fuse in him that would burn for years. He wanted meaning, not just duty. Voice, not just presence. Freedom, not just service. The House of Windsor did not yet realize how significant that internal conflict would become. Meanwhile, Charles, long misunderstood, began to experience a quiet public rehabilitation. His marriage to Camilla Parker Bowles, once unthinkable, became accepted, even respected. Camilla brought steadiness, humor, a calming presence. Slowly, the narrative shifted. This was not scandal anymore, but a story of endurance. The Queen watched all of this with a seasoned eye. She had weathered abdication, war, decolonization, fire, divorce, and tragedy. She had led the monarchy through seismic shifts in culture, politics, and media. And in the decades following Diana's death, she became, unexpectedly, the most stable figure in British public life. The House of Windsor had survived the 20th century by bending, adapting, recalibrating. But the 21st century would test it in new ways, ways no generation before could have imagined. It would bring a love story that shook the monarchy, a departure that stunned the institution, a grandmother's sorrow, a son's frustration, and a clash between tradition and identity that echoed the abdication crisis, but unfolded under the harsh glare of global media. The next act of the Windsor story is not about fire or divorce or fairy tale weddings. It is about reinvention, and about the question that has haunted monarchies since history began. How much can a crown change before it ceases to be a crown at all? The answer would be shaped not by Elizabeth, nor by Charles, nor even by the weight of tradition itself, but by a new pairing who stepped onto the world stage with cameras flashing and expectations soaring. A prince, an actress, and a love story destined to transform the monarchy once again. Reinvention, from Meghan and Harry to the future of the crown. The 21st century did not merely arrive, it accelerated. Technology dissolved the walls between private and public life. Opinions spread faster than facts. Images traveled farther than truth. For an institution built on ceremony, secrecy, and ritual, the new world posed a question sharper than any faced before. How does a monarchy survive when every moment of its existence is captured, shared, dissected, and judged? For a time, the House of Windsor found its footing. Prince William and Kate Middleton, poised, measured, elegant, presented the image of stability that the crown needed. Their courtship unfolded slowly, carefully, without the whirlwind frenzy that had consumed Charles and Diana. Their wedding in 2011 felt like a balm, a return to fairy tale splendor without the sense of danger beneath it. The monarchy exhaled, believing for a moment that the greatest storms had passed. Then Harry fell in love, and everything changed again. Meghan Markle entered the story not quietly, but like a spark dropped onto dry tinder. She was American. She was biracial. She was a self-made actress with global recognition. She spoke confidently, directly, passionately. She was, in every way, unlike anyone the British royal family had welcomed into its inner circle before. Their meeting, simple, ordinary, intimate, felt like something out of a modern romance. Two people from vastly different worlds finding connection in a private moment without cameras or courtiers. But the world they belonged to would never allow such simplicity for long. When the relationship became public, the atmosphere around the monarchy shifted instantly. For some, Meghan symbolized renewal, a fresh, modern injection into centuries of tradition. For others, she represented disruption, challenge, even threat. Old prejudices, covert and overt, surfaced in headlines, radio shows, comment sections, and whispered conversations. The scrutiny was relentless. The tone was sharp. It was Diana's story reborn, but with new stakes and new wounds. Harry, who had spent decades living in the shadow of his mother's death, recognized the danger immediately. The flashing cameras, the tabloid narratives, the distortions of every gesture, it was all painfully familiar. And this time, he could not protect the woman he loved with silence. He would fight back. Inside the royal household, the clash between tradition and modernity grew sharper. Meghan brought a perspective shaped by activism, humanitarian work, and media experience. She had built her own identity, her own voice, long before she met Harry. But the institution was not designed to accommodate individuality. It was designed to absorb it. To become royal was, historically, to become part of the crown's machinery of representation. Smooth edges, controlled statements, restrained emotion. Meghan's presence, her confidence, her willingness to speak openly about issues of race, mental health, and inequality, pushed against the boundaries of what the monarchy had been built to manage. And behind the scenes, those boundaries began to crack. Stories leaked to the press. Headlines multiplied. Comparisons to Kate were weaponized. Rifts deepened between brothers, between households, between worlds. Harry once said in an interview, "The saddest part is that some of this came from inside." He did not elaborate, he did not need to. By the time the couple announced in early 2020 that they intended to step back from royal duties, the monarchy faced something unprecedented. Not an abdication, not a divorce, not a scandal born of personal failing, but a conscious, deliberate withdrawal from the institution itself. It was a modern echo of 1936, but crafted in the language of the 21st century. Instead of a king giving up a throne for love, it was a prince giving up the royal role that had defined him since birth, for his family's safety, for his mental well-being, for a future he hoped could be lived without the constant glare of hostility. The announcement sent shockwaves through Britain and across the world. Public reactions fractured. Some sided with Harry and Meghan, calling their exit a brave stand against a system they believed had failed them. Others condemned the decision as abandonment, dereliction of duty, a betrayal of the Queen. Inside the House of Windsor, the dynamics shifted once more. Elizabeth II, ever steady, ever restrained, handled the crisis with her familiar mix of gentleness and firmness. Her public statement was short, direct, and subtly emotional. "My family and I are entirely supportive of Harry and Meghan's desire to create a new life." But she also made clear that royal privileges and responsibilities could not be separated at will. Duty had rules. Duty had limits. Harry and Meghan, choosing independence over institution, stepped into a new life across the Atlantic, one that would bring them freedom, yes, but also new forms of scrutiny and controversy. Their interviews, their projects, their stories became part of the global conversation about race, media responsibility, and the modern relevance of monarchy. Back in Britain, the Crown continued its quiet march into the 21st century. William and Kate emerged as the stable future, calm, deliberate, increasingly influential. Their growing family provided a reassuring image of continuity. Their public work, on mental health, early childhood development, environmental causes, signaled a monarchy adapting subtly, carefully, without drastic transformation. But even as the institution steadied itself, a larger shift approached. Queen Elizabeth II had reigned longer than any monarch in British history. She had guided the nation through war, decolonization, cultural revolutions, political upheavals, and personal trials. Her presence had anchored the monarchy so completely that imagining the institution without her felt almost impossible. And then in 2022, the inevitable arrived. Her death marked not only the end of a reign, but the end of an era, one defined by restraint, continuity, discipline, and the quiet dignity that had kept the crown intact through storms that would have shattered lesser institutions. Millions mourned. Millions remembered. Millions wondered what came next. Charles ascended as King Charles III, a man who had spent his entire life preparing for a role that was both privilege and burden. He brought with him decades of environmental advocacy, a nuanced but sometimes controversial public image, and a determination to streamline the monarchy for modern times. His reign began not with the fresh optimism of a young sovereign, but with the sober gravity of a world in flux. And beneath it all, the question lingered. Can monarchy survive in an age that questions every hierarchy, every tradition, every system of inherited power? The House of Windsor now stands in a landscape shaped by climate crisis, digital culture, political polarization, shifting identities, and global movements demanding transparency and justice. The crown must navigate these currents while maintaining the illusion and responsibility of timeless stability. Its future depends not only on tradition, but on reinvention. Not only on ceremony, but on sincerity. Not only on lineage, but on relevance. And the next generation, William, Kate, George, Charlotte, Louis, carry the weight of that uncertain future on their shoulders, just as Elizabeth once did at the dawn of the Second Elizabethan Age. The monarchy will not end in an explosion or collapse. If it fades, it will be through gradual erosion, unless it continues to evolve. And the House of Windsor, forged in war, reshaped by love, tested by scandal, refined by tragedy, and propelled by modernity, now stands in a moment of profound self-definition. What endures? What must change? What must be left behind? As the world watches, the Windsors step forward into a future where the crown is not guaranteed, only earned, moment by moment, generation by generation. And the story continues, as all royal stories do, not in certainty but in the delicate balance between tradition and tomorrow. The evening light settles over Windsor like a benediction. Shadows stretch across the long walk, where generations of kings and queens have passed in carriages, on horseback, and on foot. The ancient stones glow with a softness that only twilight can give, less fortress, more memory. A breeze moves through the grass, carrying with it the distant echo of voices long vanished. Soldiers singing in wartime, crowds cheering in peacetime, whispers exchanged in corridors where history held its breath. Somewhere inside the castle, a clock chimes. Its sound is steady, unhurried, unchanged. It has measured the rise and fall of empires, the birth of heirs, the tolling of loss. It has kept time for the House of Windsor across every moment, glorious, tragic, or fragile. That is the paradox of monarchy. The world transforms relentlessly, while the crown remains a promise of continuity. And yet continuity is not permanence. We walk now through the echoes of a century shaped by choices. A king who changed his name to save his throne, a brother who surrendered his crown to follow his heart, a father who found courage in his own stammer, a daughter who gave her entire life to duty, a princess who shook the monarchy to its core simply by being human, a grandson who chose love over institution, and another who must one day inherit the full weight of all these stories. The Windsors have endured bombs and headlines, devotion and disillusionment, ceremony and scrutiny. They have stood on balconies overlooking cheering crowds, and behind closed doors facing storms no one else could weather for them. But the monarchy's future, its survival, has never depended solely on crowns or bloodlines. It has depended on the fragile, shifting bond between the institution and the people who watch it, question it, support it, or walk away from it. Tonight, as dusk deepens over Windsor and the first stars emerge above its towers, the crown feels both ancient and precariously modern. A relic and a reality. A symbol and a burden. A story still in motion. And the question that lingers, quiet, insistent, unresolved, is the same one that has followed the House of Windsor through war, scandal, reinvention, and transformation. What will the monarchy become when tomorrow arrives? The answer lies not in the past, but in the unfolding journey of the family that carries a name forged in conflict, tempered in crisis, and reshaped in the constant glare of the world. The Windsors step forward into uncertainty, into expectation, into history's unending tide. Their story continues, because history never ends where we think it does. It only turns the page.